At number 6, we have Colin Baker. The second Baker to play the Doctor, though with no relation to Tom, and to be quite honest, when you watch him, that is blatantly obvious, because Colin, or Miss Piggy as Troughton used to call him, is very different from the approachable Tom Baker.
What is in this drink?
Ta-da!
Yuck.
Colin's Doctor was meant to be more of a return to the eccentric and outlandish Doctor compared to the more down-to-earth Doctor he was taking the spat-lined shoes of. But they may have gone a bit too overboard with that attempt, since the first thing he does when he regenerates is strangles his companion Perry. A shame he wasn't travelling with Mel at the time. Whilst this wasn't the best introduction to this version of the Doctor, it was meant to be something that was due to how his regeneration was apparently a bit more messed up than the previous ones and caused his body to become a bit more unstable, which makes complete sense because Colin Baker is the most manic depressive Doctor in the history of this show. One minute he can be gentle.
What happened to you?
One minute he can be violent.
Well, we all know the fate of alien spies.
One minute he can be a bit of a prima donna.
I'll be lucky if I can lift you the amount you weigh.
One minute he can be very commanding.
Well, you'll soon discover I made the right decision.
One minute he can be charming.
One morn, a Perry at the gate of Eden stood disconsolate.
One minute he can be very creepy.
If that means sacrificing you in my place, then that is the way it must be.
He's just all over the place. In fact, he's so manic depressive, it's almost impossible to discern what side he's on or what he really wants in life. But that's why he's so much fun to watch. The Doctor's key strength as a character, through all of his interpretations, is that while he may look like an ordinary person, despite his insane wardrobe, when you talk to him and are around him, his intelligence and skill becomes very clear, but still has the kind of feel about him that he's just an ordinary person. Colin Baker's performance essentially removes any kind of sense that he's an ordinary fellow, and dives headfirst into being a very eccentric, slightly effeminate, bobble-headed man, whose passion bubbles very close to the surface, and is also potentially a borderline psychotic schizophrenic madman who just so happens to have the ability to destroy the universe if he felt like it. This is why Colin is considered to be one of the more unpopular Doctors, because of how much of a departure he is from every Doctor both before and since, and how much more desensitized he is to death and destruction. But for some, they really love that part of him, myself included, and Colin Baker is one hell of a good actor, and he has a very magnetic and amiable aura that he can project into his performances, and he really pulls off the role because of it. I can certainly understand if you don't like this Doctor. He's very difficult to get a grasp on and feel safe in his hands, because almost nobody does, but I can enjoy him because of all of his faults and foibles compared to other Doctors. And like I said, Colin Baker can really pull off this role, and really makes the Doctor feel more magnetic than others, where even if you don't like him as much, it's really hard to stop watching him. Kinda like when you see a bird get hit by a train, or watch any of the kill scenes from Farthing Wood. The major downside of his Doctor is how ambitious Colin was in what he wanted to do with the Doctor. Colin had a great hand in the direction of his run, and wanted for his Doctor to have as much story and development as Tom Baker did, and even possibly more so, which, to be honest, even David Tennant would have had trouble in trying to do that, and not for lack of trying either. So sadly Colin's run was cut very short, to the point where he's the only Doctor to have never regenerated on screen. In fact, there was an entire series scripted which would have resolved with him regenerating, but due to a rating slump and budget cut, they had to scrap it. And thus, Colin Baker was very unceremoniously dropped from the show. And it also doesn't help that his run had some of the most insane and hard to follow stories of the franchise. Just to put into perspective, I primarily watch Doctor Who while it's playing on my computer while I'm playing video games or doing other work. With the Colin Baker episode, I have to divert my full attention just so I know what's going on. Though to be fair, if I didn't do that, I'd miss the part where the Doctor found a xenomorph in one episode. No, I'm not joking.
Yeah.
So for what we got, I really do like Colin Baker. Even if he's a bit standoffish and his personality is really hard to get a grasp on, if you give him a chance, I think you might like him. Though at the very least he got a longer tenure than the next guy. At number 5, we have Christopher Eccleston. The first Doctor of the modern series, and quite an underrated one in my opinion. Like most actors when they first played the Doctor, Eccleston was a relatively unknown actor, mostly known for playing bit parts, but he had a lot of experience in acting. So he knew how to play the game, which is a perfect choice for playing the Doctor, since you want somebody who isn't going to distract you too much from being a recognisable figure, though, to be honest, not necessarily the best choice when trying to bring a franchise like Doctor Who back to the modern audience, which I think is a reason why a lot of people haven't watched his run. Eccleston's Doctor is best described as a more northern version of Tom Baker, having the same sense of jolly and gleeful personality mixed with his quick wit.
You think I can travel through space and time and haven't got a phone?
That won't last. He's gay and she's an alien.
You're not making sense.
I might never make sense again. I might have two heads. Or no head. Imagine me with no head.
But this hides a very dry, stern and borderline cruel personality.
Because once in a while, on a whim, if the wind's in the right direction, you happen to be kind.
Only a killer would know that.
Why don't you finish the job and make the Daleks extinct? Rid the universe of your filth. Why don't you just die?
You would make a good Dalek.
And I think it was a good idea to have the first new Doctor in years so closely resembled the most iconic version of himself. But Eccleston does bring a lot of his own flair to the role, most notably his accent, but also how he has a much larger sense of regret and wanting to forget the past in his performance, which of course comes from how he's the Doctor who has come after the War Doctor, so he has all those memories of the Time War rattling around in his head. And they're quite recent memories if we take his comments about his own face in the first episode seriously.
Oh, could have been worse. Look at the ears.
He also has the tendency to be very quick to his actions and doesn't quite think everything through perfectly, which becomes part of his character arc when he finds that his very hasty nature accidentally made a situation worse rather than better. The one part I found quite hard to accept about this particular Doctor is how harsh he could be to people he didn't like, especially Mickey, which really didn't help how pathetic they wrote Mickey's character in Series 1. But to be fair, Eccleston can really pull this off, and you can tell he's just messing around.
He's an alien, he's a thing.
He's not invited.
And he did a much better job with it than Tennant did, who you could tell wanted to treat Mickey nicely, but the script wouldn't let him. I really enjoyed Eccleston's short-lived run, and I really wish he stayed on to do more, but sadly he wasn't the kind of person who was inclined to stay. But give it a few more Doctors later, and we really did get one who was inclined to stay. At number 4, we have Peter Capaldi. The Scottish grump himself, and the guy who actually started a bit of a fan theory of mine, which we'll get into later. Capaldi wasn't the first Scottish actor to play the Doctor, but he was the first to be allowed to keep his accent, and that was probably for the best, since he both doesn't do a good English accent, plus it really works well with his character, that being grumpy, curmudgeon-y, and not really caring for many people besides himself.
This is Clara, not my assistant. She's some other word.
I'm his carer.
Yeah, my carer. She cares, so I don't have to.
Starting to sound familiar at all? However, he's also got more going for him than just that, since he's also got some rather gaping flaws in his sense of social interaction, and at times almost comes off like a mildly autistic man, which I think was sort of intentional.
You probably feel a bit sick. Please don't be.
Robin Hood laughs in the face of all.
Ha ha ha! And do people ever punch you in the face when you do that?
Unlike other actors who have played the Doctor, Capaldi had been in quite a few things when he started his role, such as starring as a guest role in The Vicar of Dibley, and most significantly playing the foul-mouthed and awesomely terrifying Malcolm Turner in the political satire show The Thick of It, a performance which is shockingly similar to his performance as the Doctor.
Where do you think you are? In some fucking Regency costume drama? This is a government department, not a fucking Jane fucking Austen novel.
Now, as I implied earlier, Capaldi's performance does bear a striking similarity to Hartnell, but he is a bit more complex than him, but the similarities are definitely noticeable, to the point where they even pointed out in an episode where the 1st and the 12th Doctor run into each other.
You may be a doctor, but I am the Doctor.
This actually started a bit of a fan theory of mine. Well, not a theory so much, more of an observation, that each new version of the Doctor is playing a revised version of an older Doctor, either through their character or their performance. For example, I mentioned that Eccleston resembled Tom Baker quite closely, and Tennant also resembles his father-in-law quite a bit, and Matt Smith resembles Patrick Troughton. Capaldi's resemblance to Hartnell is the most obvious of all of these, but in a way it's quite fitting since his inclusion was supposed to be a fresh start from the show, moving from the style of stories and tone that the Matt Smith era had, and going for more of a dark and moody style. So his resemblance to the darkest and moodiest old Doctor fits with that. Whittaker is the only loose end in this theory, since she doesn't really resemble any of the old Doctors that much, not counting how she's written much like the 10th Doctor. Colin Baker is the only one I can see some similarities with, due to how they're both very eclectic and somewhat mentally clumsy, but even that's a bit of a stretch. Even though the run that Capaldi himself was in is not one of my favourites of the series, he is still one of my all-time favourite Doctors, and his performance alone makes the series worth watching. But now, we move on to a Doctor where both his run and he himself are some of the best that the franchise has to offer. And quite ironically was also the first Scottish actor to play the Doctor. At number 3, we have Sylvester McCoy. The last of the classic Doctors. If you don't count McGann, of course, and McCoy was one of the best Doctors to end the series on, even if his run was a brief one. Sylvester McCoy is the Doctor who arguably had the most outlandish fashion sense. I mean, yeah, Colin Baker's coat was pretty wild, but then there comes a guy with a cardigan with question marks all over it and a matching umbrella, a cream white fedora with a stripe that matches his shirt, and a scarf with bohemian symbols on it and tartan trousers?
What sort of costume do you call that?
Are we sure he's not some sort of Scottish regeneration of Elton John? McCoy's era of Doctor Who is best described as a combination of the outlandish space adventures of the 80s Doctors and a return to the more grounded action adventures of Pertwee's run, and his performance matches that perfectly. In quite the contrast to his predecessor, McCoy is by far more friendly and accessible, if a little firm-handed and strict sometimes.
Elementary diplomacy, my dear Ace. We must try and convince her we're nice, clean-living people who eat up all our fresh fruit and pay our way.
In fact, he almost feels like a stern but lovable granddad or teacher, with the way he seems up for doing just about anything, no matter how it's thrown at him, how he has a love for tricks and ploys, and the way he acts more of a guardian to his companions, especially Ace, who is also one of the best companions of the series as well.
My young friend's something of an expert.
What, in archaeology?
No. Explosives!
Slow down!
I think the timer needs work.
One of these days we're going to have a nice long talk about acceptable safety standards.
And while like all Doctors he has a rough side, it's blended into his regular disposition so flawlessly that when he has to get tough, or in some cases slightly sociopathic, it actually feels very natural.
I would like a ticket actually. I'd like a there and back off-peak weekend break, Super Saver Senior Citizen bi-monthly season with optional luggage facilities, a free cup of coffee in a plastic glass, a crocodile sandwich and make it snappy, you metallic moron!
He's also well known for his ability to manipulate his foes and plan out his schemes to every last detail, especially in the episodes Curse of Fenric and Remembrance of the Daleks, hence why he's often referred to as a chess master. I feel that the 7th Doctor is the kind of Doctor that fits the mood of the 80s better than any other Doctor of the era. He's very level-headed, and the way he acts mixed with his unique interests and hobbies, it perfectly sums up the way Britain was in the late 80s in a cultural sense, and his series reflects that too, since the style and use of sound effects and music, and even the use of settings, have a great feel of 80s British sci-fi to them. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if any of the people who worked on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series worked on the McCoy run, because the production styles do look very similar. Almost every 80s version of the Doctor had sets, stories and styles that still made it feel like it was the 70s, with the exception of some of Colin Baker's serials like Vengeance on Varos and Revelation of the Daleks. But McCoy brought the show right into the neon lights and synth pop of the Reagan era. A shame it ended at the same time Reagan's term did. Though to be honest, I don't think any of us wanted to see a Doctor during the Bush senior years. He's also the only actor who's played the Doctor I've met. And just to explain this photo, yes, he's a little short, but he only looks short because I'm quite tall. and more than a little overweight too. Why do I always have to wear this shirt? It makes me look terrible. But McCoy is definitely one of the best Doctors, and I really had to debate whether he was my favourite of the classic era. But while he is a lot of fun, the fact that he came at the end of the series' lifespan does hinder what he could have done for the series. Whereas the next entry essentially made Doctor Who a household name. At number 2, we have Jon Pertwee. The first Doctor to be filmed in colour, Jon Pertwee was the actor who took Doctor Who from being an already popular show and really helped it on its journey into becoming a cultural milestone. A much more dashing and debonair Doctor than the previous ones, especially due to his skill in swordsmanship and Venusian karate.
Good evening.
He's much more like a character out of an old pulp novel or adventure story like Zorro or one of the Three Musketeers. However, his key skill and centre of his personality comes from how apt and broad his scientific knowledge is.
Buffer the molecular movement of the air with reverse-phase shortwaves. It's quite simple.
Simple? It's impossible.
With recorded classical aerodynamics, it's impossible for a bumblebee to fly.
Being able to do just about anything given the right materials and resources, this Doctor had a passion for scientific endeavours and will stop at nothing to acquire more knowledge, even if it means he might unwittingly put those he cares about in danger. Part of the reason he's such a science hound is down to how his series was written. You see, after 2 series of ridiculous space adventures, the BBC decided it was time to tone things down a bit. So they wrote the Doctor had been banished to Earth by the Time Lords without his TARDIS and was forced to stay on Earth. This is what led him to become the scientific advisor of UNIT, the Doctor Who equivalent of S.H.I.E.L.D. from the Marvel Universe, and basically only helped out because he was bored and needed something to do. And thankfully UNIT seems to be a magnet for alien threats, not the least of which being the Master, who made his first appearance in Pertwee's run. The Pertwee era of Doctor Who is also where the budget, pace and action was kicked well up, and while it may still seem quite quaint by today's standards, this was incredible to see back on British TV in the day, made even more so when you find out that Pertwee did all of his own stunts. If you want a microcosm of what this series is like, just check out the chase scene from the episode Planet of the Spiders. Although when you watch that scene now, it's impossible not to splice this music in. But this more action-packed element to the show is all the more ironic when you consider that most of Pertwee's adventures took place on Earth, since the Doctor was essentially grounded by the Time Lords and not allowed to venture anywhere outside Earth. And to be fair, this more hyped-up style of the show was probably needed to keep up with the new breeds of show that were emerging at this time, like The Prisoner, Charlie's Angels and Dragnet. In fact, arguably when taking inflation into account, the budget in the Pertwee run was the highest the show has ever been, and Pertwee's old-fashioned action hero persona fits that mold perfectly. As such, the Pertwee era of Doctor Who is my favourite of the classic series, but even taking that out of the argument, Pertwee is still my favourite of the classic era Doctors just from his incredible performance. And thankfully in this series he didn't dress up like a scarecrow and talk like a member of Tony Robinson's Time Team.
I was weeping and sniffling on salad, and pulling the wings of these pretty flowers what I give you.
And now we've come to the final entry, which, to be honest, if you know about Doctor Who, you already know who it is through process of elimination. But let's give him a proper introduction anyway. And my number 1 personal favourite Doctor of all time is... Matt Smith. This may seem like an odd choice to some, since a majority of Doctor Who's audience at the time stopped tuning in when David Tennant stopped being the Doctor, because once there was no David Tennant, they felt like they had nothing to tune in for, so a lot of them didn't give Matt Smith a chance. But here is why you should. Matt Smith was the herald of the Stephen Moffat era of Doctor Who, an era that, even I'll admit, had its ups and downs in quality and enjoyment, but for the first few seasons I regard it as the best that the modern day Doctor Who has ever been, with amazing stories, fantastic use of tone, style and iconography, great characters, interesting monsters, and while some of the story arcs for the seasons were biting off a bit more they can chew in what they could do sometimes, it's still the most ambitious Doctor Who has ever been in its storytelling. And while it didn't always go well, the fact that it didn't fail catastrophically is still very impressive, and this comes back to its centerpiece, that being my all-time favourite Doctor. As I mentioned before, Matt Smith's Doctor most greatly resembles the second Doctor in terms of performance, but with a great deal more confidence and energy to him. To sum up, he's very much like an excitable child who is amazed by everything he sees and treats almost everything like it's new to him.
I know what I need fish fingers and custard.
And while this can get annoying sometimes if it's done in the wrong hands, Moffat's incredibly charming writing and Smith's flawless delivery really sells this character, and to me is the version of the Doctor who is the most fun to watch and is the most identifiable, but at the same time has an incredible amount of depth to him. Since the times where he has to get serious, you really feel his age, his experience, his regrets and his rage.
Nobody talk to me, nobody.
Who has anything to say to me today?
But unlike Tom Baker and Eccleston, where you can tell that this is who they really are behind their more lighter-hearted veneer, the 11th Doctor seems like he despises having to be angry and aggressive, and that he wants to be a more fun-loving, carefree time wanderer, and just go wherever he wants to and do whatever he wants, without having to keep running into consequences. And despite all the hardships he keeps going through, he still keeps that gleeful disposition up, and it's so infectious that it's almost impossible not to love him because of it. Matt Smith is a Doctor that feels like he has everything in him that should be there. The lovable personality, the shades of regret and age that shadow his character, the knowledge and centuries of experience that make him such a great hero, and the feel that he is a person that you want to travel the universe with. Some people do find him a bit annoying and felt that he was too much of a contrast from the slightly more grounded Doctor we had previously, and that's totally fine. But, from my opinion, Matt Smith is the best Doctor the show has ever had because he genuinely feels like all the Doctors we've had before combined into one. Hartnell's mood swings, Troughton's goofiness, Pertwee's ingenuity, Tom's love of exploration and anticipation, Davison's gentle and polite nature, Colin's eccentricness, McCoy's calculative and manipulative genius, McGann's childish glee, Eccleston's sense of command and Tennant's charm. These are all things that we love about the Doctors that came before, and in my opinion, Smith has all of these and more.
Hello. I'm the Doctor.
Of course, there are going to be many people who disagree with this list, but you know what? They're perfectly entitled to. And if you want to give your own 2 cents, please put your own list and reasons in the comments below. But for now, I've had enough of this. I'm going on the other side to have a bath. Bye!